HMS King George V was the lead ship of the 5 British King George V-class battleships of the Royal Navy, laid down in 1937 and commissioned in 1940. King George V operated during the Second World War as part of the British Home and Pacific fleets. In May 1941, along with HMS Rodney, King George V was involved in the hunt for and pursuit of the German battleship Bismarck, eventually inflicting severe damage which led to the German vessel sinking. On 1 May 1942, destroyer HMS Punjabi sank after a collision with King George V in foggy conditions. King George V took part in Operation Husky and bombarded the island of Levanzo and the port of Trapani. She also escorted part of the surrendered Italian fleet, which included the battleships Andrea Doria and Caio Duilio, to Malta. In 1945, King George V took part in operations against the Japanese in the Pacific. Following the war, King George V spent 3 years as the flagship of the British Home Fleet, was placed in reserve in 1949, and scrapped 8 years later. Design. General characteristics. King George V was built by Vickers Armstrong at Walker Naval Yard, Newcastle upon Tyne. She was laid down on 1 January 1937, launched on 21 February 1939 and commissioned on 11 December 1940. The ship had an overall length of 745 feet, a beam of 112 feet and a draft of 34 feet. She displaced 38,031 tons at normal load and 42,237 tons at full load. After her refit in 1944, she displaced 44,460 tons at full load. She could carry 3,918 tons of fuel oil, 192 tons of diesel oil, 256 tons of reserve feed water and 444 tons of fresh water. Based on the design, fuel consumption range was 4,000 nautical miles at 25 knots, 10,250 nautical miles at 15 knots and 14,400 nautical miles at 10 knots. However, in practice fuel consumption was much higher, and at 10 knots the actual range was about 7,000 nautical miles. Designed within the tight 35,000-ton limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty, wartime service necessitated increases over the design displacement, seriously reducing freeboard and affecting seaworthiness. This was most acute at the already low bow. With too little buoyancy forward, the bows were easily buried even in moderate seas, with spray washing up over both forward turrets. Heavy seas could flood a turret, drenching both men and machinery within. Propulsion. King George V was equipped with 8 Admiralty boilers. This configuration was a little more conventional than the Nelson class, with boiler rooms placed side by side and with each pair associated with a turbine room astern of them. The total heating surface of the boiler plants in King George V was 78,144 square feet. The 416-ton boiler installation produced more than 100,000 shaft horsepower, giving a top speed of 28 knots. The 8 boilers were more economic in space and fuel than the 24 boilers in the battlecruiser HMS Hood. Fewer but larger boilers lowered the weight per unit of heat delivered, as did increased boiler efficiency and consumption of fuel per unit area of heating surface. This made King George V the fastest battleship in the British fleet, but slower than the German, French of the new Italian capital ships, or the battlecruisers HMS Hood, Repulse and HMS Renown. King George V had 4 sets of Parsons-geared turbines. 2 main turbines were arranged in series and drove a shaft through double helical gears, and a stern turbine was incorporated in the exhaust casing of the low-pressure turbine, and a cruising turbine was coupled directly to the high-pressure turbine. A speed of 28.5 knots was expected at standard displacement and 27.5 knots at full load displacement on normal output. Corresponding speeds at overload condition were 29.25 and 28.25 knots respectively. The turbine unit was a low-speed type coupled to a single reduction gear which produced 236 revolutions per minute at the propeller shaft. Armament main battery. The tight limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty raised many challenges and required difficult compromises if they were to be met, to avoid the class being outgunned by the new ships of foreign navies, especially as by the mid-1930s the treaty had been renounced by Japan and Italy. Churchill wrote to the First Lord of the Admiralty in 1936, voicing strong objections to the proposed armament of 10 14-inch guns. His proposal was for 9 16-inch guns. However, when completed, King George V mounted 10 14-inch guns. They were mounted in 1 Mark II twin turret forward and 2 Mark III quadruple turrets, 1 forward and 1 aft. They could be elevated 40 degrees and depressed 3 degrees. Training arcs were A. Turret 286 degrees, B. Turret 270 degrees, and Y. Turret 270 degrees. Training and elevating was achieved through a hydraulic drive, with rates of 2 and 8 degrees per second, respectively. A full gun broadside weighed 15,950 pounds. Of salvo could be fired every 40 seconds. The quadruple turrets weighed 1,582 tons, the twin turret 915 tons. The turrets were designed by the Vickers Armstrong's Ellswick Works, but sets of each type of equipment were manufactured by Vickers Armstrong's in Barrow. A considerable amount of design effort was expended to make the turrets as flash-tight as possible. This complicated the mechanical design of the turrets, particularly the quadruple mountings, due to insufficient clearances and slightly distorted link mechanisms. Failures in the intricate safety interlocks in the loading sequence for anti-flash precautions caused jams during drills and practice firing. King George V used an Admiralty Fire Control Table Mark IX to control her main armament. Secondary battery. The secondary armament consisted of 16 times 5.25-inch guns in 8 twin mounts, weighing 81 tons each. They were grouped at the 4 corners of the citadel, with a twin mount on the main deck and another superimposed above it nearer amidships. This disposition gave better arcs of fire, freedom from blast, more separation of the magazines, and a better arrangement of the ammunition supply. The cupolas for these mounts revolved on either the upper or superstructure deck. Between deck mountings traveled on roller paths on the armored deck. This permitted a flat trajectory, a high-angle fire. Loading was semi-automatic. Normal rate of fire was 10 to 12 rounds per minute. The maximum range of the MKI guns was 24,070 yards at a 45-degree elevation. The anti-aircraft ceiling was 49,000 feet. The guns could be elevated to 70 degrees and depressed to 5 degrees. However, the guns could only practically fire 7 to 8 rounds per minute, due to the heavy weight of the shell and the fact that the 5.25-inch round was semi-fixed, requiring the crew to separately load the cartridge and shell into the breech. King George V introduced the high-angle control system Mark IVGB anti-aircraft fire control system to the Royal Navy, which, along with the MKIV pom-pom director, pioneered the use of the gyro rate unit. Anti-aircraft battery. The King George V design had four 0.5-INCH quadruple machine gun mounts, but in 1939 these were replaced by two Mark VI pom-pom mounts. In 1940, to combat air attack, four unrotated projectile mountings were fitted on B turret, two on Y turret. One replaced a pom-pom mount added in 1939 at the stern. The pom-poms mounted in the King George V were designed and produced by Vickers Armstrongs as a result of a post-First World War requirement for a multiple mounting which was effective against close-range bombers or torpedo planes. The first model, tested in 1927, was superior to anything developed in other countries at the time, and in 1938 the Mark VI * had a muzzle velocity of 2,400 feet per second, a 1.594-inch bore and a barrel length of 40 calibers. They fired a 1.8-pound shell at a rate of 96 to 98 rounds per minute for controlled fire and 115 rounds per minute for automatic fire. The range of the Mark VI * was 6,800 yards at a muzzle velocity of 2,300 feet per second. The Mark VI octuple mount weighed 16 tons. The Mark VII quadruple mount weighed 10.8 tons. If power-operated, it could be elevated to 80 degrees and depressed to 10 degrees at a rate of 25 degrees per second, which was also the rate of train. The normal ammunition supply on board for the Mark VI was 1,800 rounds per barrel. King George V introduced the MKIV pom-pom director to the Royal Navy in 1940, becoming the first ship in the world to feature gyroscopic target tracking in tachometric anti-aircraft directors. Operational history. The first of her class to be completed, King George V was commissioned at her shipyard and sailed for Rosyth in Scotland on 16 October 1940. She took on board her ammunition and began her sea trials. By the end of the year she had joined the home fleet at Scapa Flow. She crossed the Atlantic early in 1941 to take Lord Halifax, the ambassador to the United States, to Annapolis and covered an eastbound convoy on her return, arriving back at Scapa Flow on 6 February. Her next task was to provide distant cover for Operation Claymore, the Royal Marines' raid on the Lofoten Islands off the northwest coast of Norway. She escorted further Atlantic convoys, HX 104 and HX 115 during March. Action with Bismarck. When Bismarck along with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen broke out into the Atlantic Ocean, King George V sailed on the 22nd of May with HMS Victorious and 11 cruisers and destroyers in support of the cruiser patrols off Iceland. King George V was the flagship of Admiral Sir John Tovey, who commanded the force. King George V was still 300 to 400 miles away on the morning of the 24th of May, when HMS Prince of Wales and Hood engaged both Bismarck and Prinz Eugen. Hood was sunk and Prince of Wales was damaged when taking fire from both Bismarck and Prinz Eugen and forced to retire. The German battleship Bismarck, although damaged, and Prinz Eugen continued south. The British relocated Bismarck at 10:30 on the 26th of May, when a Catalina flying boat of RAF Coastal Command sighted her, heading for the French port of Brest. Rodney and King George V were still about 125 miles away. The aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal was ordered to launch an air attack, and at 22:25 her torpedo bombers, a flight of fairy swordfishes, damaged Bismarck, slowing her down and jamming her rudder, forcing her to turn back out into the Atlantic, away from the safety of port. At 1500 Rodney joined King George V and they maintained 22 knots, which was nearly maximum speed for Rodney. King George V had only 32% of her fuel left, while Rodney had only enough fuel to continue the chase at high speed until 8 o'clock the following day. Admiral Tovey signaled his battle plan to Rodney just before sunrise on the 27th of May. She was free to maneuver independently as long as she conformed, generally, to the movements of King George V. Both ships were to close the range to 15,000 yards as quickly as possible, then turn for broadside fire. At 8:15 HMS Norfolk spotted Bismarck and turned away out of range. She soon sighted the other British ships off her starboard quarter, and informed them that Bismarck was roughly 50,000 yards to the southwest. By 8:43 King George V had Bismarck in sight at 20,500 yards. 4 minutes later Rodney opened fire. King George V followed suit in less than a minute. Bismarck answered almost immediately, stratting Rodney on her second salvo. By 8:59 King George V had closed to 16,000 yards and all her 14-inch guns were firing. Rodney was firing full 16-inch salvos. Bismarck concentrated all her remaining guns on King George V, but only an occasional shell came close. At 9:14 King George V, at 12,000 yards, had opened fire with her 5.25-inch guns, and Rodney had moved to 8,500–9,000 yards. At 9:27 a shell hitting Bismarck penetrated the hydraulic machinery in turret Anton, and disabled it, causing the guns to run down to maximum depression. Her topsides were erect, and a large fire burned amidships. After firing steadily for over 30 minutes without any problems, King George V, by 9:27, began having trouble with her main battery, and from that point onward every salvo missed at least one gun due to failures in the safety interlocks for anti-flash protection and from ammunition feed jams. At 10:21, with Bismarck silenced and obviously sinking, Admiral Tovey detailed the crews at Dorsetshire to finish her off with torpedoes. King George V fired 339 14 inches and over 700 5.25 inches shells during the action. As both Rodney and King George V were low on fuel, they returned to port at 19 knots, escorted by 11 destroyers to guard against German era submarine attack. The next day, after the escort was reduced to 3 destroyers, 4 German aircraft did attack but scored no hits. Both King George V and Rodney returned to port safely, but the destroyer HMS Mashona, sent ahead to refuel, was bombed and sunk. Collision damage. After repairs and adjustments to her guns, King George V attacked German shipping in the Glom Fjord, Norway, in October 1941. She then covered convoys to Russia. On the 1st of May 1942 she was operating with US Washington as an escort to convoy PQ-15, and collided with the destroyer HMS Punjabi, which had maneuvered to avoid a mine and cross turbo in dense fog. Punjabi was cut in two and King George V had 40 feet of her bow badly damaged. King George V entered the Gladstone dock in Liverpool on the 9th of May for repairs by camel-led, and returned to Scapa Flow on the 1st of July 1942. The battleship didn't leave Scapa Flow until December 18, when she finally resumed convoy escort duty, providing distant cover for the Arctic convoy JW-51A. Mediterranean operations. In May 1943, King George V was moved to Gibraltar in preparation for Operation Husky. King George V and her sister ship HMS Howe were allocated to the reserve covering group when the operation got underway on 1 July. The two ships bombarded Trapani in Sicily on 12 July and also helped defend against an air raid whilst in Algiers prior to departing for Operation Avalanche. The two ships also bombarded the islands of Levanzo and Favignana, after which they were in the reserve group for the Salerno landings which began on 9 September. King George V escorted part of the Italian fleet, including the battleships Andrea Doria and Caio Duilio, to Malta after the armistice, and with Howe provided cover for the 1st Airborne Division, who were transported to Taranto in support of Operation Slapstick from 9 to the 11th of September by the cruiser Usboisi and the fast mine-layer HMS Abdiel. The battleship then escorted a naval force which occupied the Italian naval base at Taranto. She later escorted surrendered Italian ships from Malta to Alexandria. After bombarding German positions during the Salerno landings, King George V returned to the United Kingdom. Pacific operations. King George V was in Liverpool for an overhaul from March to June 1944. It included the installation of additional radar gear, more anti-aircraft guns, improved accommodation and ventilation. On 28 October 1944, King George V sailed from Scapa Flow under the command of Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser to join other Royal Navy units assembling at Trincomalee in Ceylon. A stop at Alexandria en route enabled her to divert to Milos in the Aegean Sea to bombard German positions. On 1 December she resumed her eastward journey, arriving in Trincomalee on 15 December. King George V got underway again on 16 January 1945. The flotilla, known as Task Force 63, comprised King George V, the aircraft carriers HMS Illustrious, Indomitable, Indefatigable and Victorious, 4 cruisers and 10 destroyers. The first stage of the voyage was covering the 11,000 nautical miles to Sydney. En route, the force attacked oil refineries on Sumatra in Operation Meridian. They also practiced replenishment at sea and beat off a Japanese air attack, with King George V's anti-aircraft crews shooting down one Mitsubishi Ki-21. Joined by Howe and redesignated Task Force 57, the British Pacific Fleet was again involved in operations in late March 1945, when it launched attacks on the Sakashima gun-to airfields, a task it repeated in early May. On 4 May 1945, King George V led battleships and cruisers in a 45-minute bombardment of Japanese air facilities in the Ryukyu Islands. As the Allies approached the Japanese homeland, King George V was dispatched in mid-July to join the U.S. battleships in a bombardment of industrial installations at Hitachi. King George V fired 267 rounds from her 14-inch guns during this operation. The task force then moved on to Hamamatsu in southern Honshu, where it carried out a further bombardment of aviation factories. During the Okinawa War campaign, the battleship supported 4 fast carriers of the British Pacific Fleet. Her last offensive action was a night bombardment of Hamamatsu on 29 and 30 July 1945. With the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the surrender that followed, King George V moved with other units of the British Pacific Fleet into Tokyo Bay to be present at the surrender ceremonies. Post-war, in January 1946, she conveyed the Duke and Duchesses of Gloucester on an official visit to Australia, returning to Portsmouth in March. She was flagship of the Home Fleet until December 1946, after becoming a training vessel. King George V's active naval career was terminated by the Royal Navy in June 1950. when she and her sister ships went into reserve and were mothballed. King George V was the first large warship to be preserved in this fashion. This involved sealing the armament, machinery and boilers against damp and installing dehumidifiers throughout. In December 1955, she was downgraded to extended reserve, and in 1957 the decision was taken to scrap the 4 ships. The following year, King George V was moved from her berth in Gaelic to the shipbreaking firm of Arnott Young & Co. in Dalmuir to undergo dismantling, refits. During her career, King George V was refitted on several occasions in order to update her equipment. The following are the dates and details of the refits undertaken.